On an amber October morning in Chicago, Claire Donovan walked beside her parents through the departing crowd at O'Hare, the rolling chorus of announcements washing over them like a tide. Her father kept glancing back to make sure she was keeping up. Her mother fussed with the silk scarf she'd insisted on wearing even for a short flight. They were both in good spirits, talking about a winter renovation bid Donovan Construction Group had nearly secured and teasing Claire for never taking a proper vacation. She laughed because they were laughing, because that was how mornings with them had always been. Her father's dry wit, her mother's habit of squeezing her hand twice before saying goodbye, as if the second squeeze could stitch the first into memory. They hugged at the security rope, promised to call after landing, and disappeared toward the bright, indifferent gate. By early afternoon, the sky had dulled to pewter, low clouds dragging a wet edge across the city. The first hint that something had gone wrong came as a delayed text thread that didn't refresh, then as a news bulletin at the bottom of a muted television in a coffee shop. An aircraft diverted, communications lost, preliminary reports of an accident. The word accident sat in Claire's chest like ice, an object too cold to touch. She called, then called again, then stood outside in the wind with her phone at her ear, listening to the endless, mechanical ring that pretends a connection exists. When confirmation arrived, official, clipped, inexorable, she sank down on the foyer rug of the house in Lincoln Park and felt the edges of the world pull wide and thin. The home that had held birthdays and Sunday dinners and late-night design arguments became a cavern where her footfalls echoed back as if from someone else's life. Days slid into each other with the strange brightness of grief. People arrived with covered dishes and solemn voices, and then, just as quickly, they were gone, like a tide receding and leaving behind neat stacks of paper. There were forms to sign, arrangements to finalize, accounts to verify, signatures to match with names she'd known all her life. Eric handled most of it, moving through rooms with a quiet efficiency that looked like mercy. He took calls when she couldn't, guided her through the receiving line at the memorial, and stood behind her when words failed. In the evenings, he made tea she never drank, set it on the edge of her father's desk, and said her name softly until she remembered to breathe. When he touched her shoulder, she leaned into the pressure as if the touch itself might hold her together. The company waited, or at least that was what everyone said. Donovan Construction Group had crews on multiple sites and a short list of municipal bids that could not go unwatched. Eric explained this gently, his voice a careful instrument tuned to her exhaustion. "It's temporary," he told her, laying a folder on the blotter. "Financial proxies, vendor approvals, payroll authority. A bridge until you're ready. I'll carry the load. You approve the big decisions. We'll keep your father's standards. Nothing changes that matters." The words were a raft, and she, unmoored, climbed aboard. She initialed here and here, signed full name there, and let him place each document in a neat stack. He had already found the notary, already color-tabbed the pages in a sequence that required no thinking. Somewhere inside the static of sorrow, she noticed his steadiness and mistook it for safety. The lawyers who sent condolences also sent language. Durable power of attorney, limited authority, operating continuity, business necessity. Claire read none of it. Reading implied comprehension. Comprehension implied endurance. She had neither. She remembered her father once saying that construction was 90% preparation and 10% weather, and she wondered which part grief belonged to. In meetings, she made it through a greeting, a nod, a polite silence. Eric answered questions in the warm baritone he used when negotiating with suppliers, an easy current for others to drift along. When he slid a fountain pen toward her, she took it. When he said, "This will avoid delays," she believed him. Love in those weeks meant permission to not be strong, to not be present, to not be alone. Nights were the hardest. Rain gnawed at the gutters, a delicate, constant tapping that found its way into the house's old bones. Claire sat by the tall west-facing window in the library, knees drawn up, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, though she was never truly cold. Across the street, a maple shed its leaves one dark handful at a time. red bleeding to brown on the wet sidewalk. The city thinned to headlights and distant sirens. The tea beside her cooled and skinned over. Sometimes she talked aloud to no one. Sometimes she spoke to the portrait of her parents taken on a windy pier 2 summers ago, her mother laughing mid-turn, her father's hat about to lift. "I'm still here," she said, and the words felt both true and impossible. When she could not speak, she counted the slow beats of rain and told herself that endurance was a kind of faith. In the quiet after midnight, Eric would find her there and coax her to bed, his palm warm at the small of her back, his voice a low thread that led her down the hall. He left lamps on, as if soft light could out-talk the dark. "You don't have to be everywhere," he murmured when she apologized for missing a call. "You don't have to be anything except mine." The phrasing brushed past her, harmless as a draft. He was protecting her, she thought. That was what marriage meant when the ground dropped away. So when he suggested expanding the authorization, vendor contracts needed timely signatures, payroll had rigid cycles. Banks demanded consistency, she signed again. The pen moved, the lines filled. The machinery of a life continued to hum. Outside, the rain held steady. Inside, a paper door swung open on oiled hinges, and behind it a stairwell began its quiet descent. Claire did not see it yet. She only heard the rain and told herself, like a promise, that at least she still had him. Long before grief hollowed the house in Lincoln Park, there had been music, light, and the kind of easy laughter that comes with youth. Claire remembered the evening she met Eric as if it were drawn through gauze, soft, golden, almost unreal. It was a fundraising gala hosted by a friend from Northwestern University, held at a glass-walled event hall that overlooked Lake Michigan. The air smelled faintly of perfume and champagne. The skyline shimmered behind them like a promise. Eric Donovan wasn't on the guest list for her circle. He was there representing the finance department of Donovan Construction, the company her father owned. Someone introduced him as one of the sharp new analysts. He shook her hand with the quiet assurance of someone who knew how to read a room. His suit wasn't expensive, but it fit him perfectly. He spoke in a low, calm voice that carried none of the swagger she was used to from the sons of her parents' friends. He asked questions that sounded like he genuinely cared about the answers. They danced once, under strings of white lights, to a jazz standard her mother used to hum while cooking. When the song ended, Eric didn't press for another. He just smiled and said, "You seem like the kind of person who remembers what matters." That line stayed with her long after she went home that night. What followed was the kind of romance that looks effortless from the outside and quietly rearranges someone's life from within. Eric sent handwritten notes instead of texts, remembered the names of her colleagues, and brought her coffee during late nights at the office. He never flaunted ambition, only humility, always the supportive one, the listener, the man who wanted nothing more than to see her happy. Her parents admired his manners, but remained cautious. Her father once asked over dinner, "Does he make you better, Claire? Or smaller?" She'd laughed then, dismissing it as overprotectiveness. They married 9 months later, a spring wedding wrapped in magnolia blossoms and optimism. The ceremony was elegant but modest by Chicago standards. Eric's eyes shone with emotion when he said his vows. Her mother dabbed her cheeks. At the reception, he held Claire's hand the whole time, as if to anchor her amid the whirl of congratulations. "You're my home now," he whispered. It felt safe, simple, right? For the first year, marriage was a cocoon. Eric took an interest in the business, but claimed he preferred to stay out of boardrooms. He asked thoughtful questions about her father's projects, about budgets and contractors, about the way deals were brokered. When her father praised him as steady and detail-oriented, Claire beamed. She thought she'd married someone her parents could finally trust. Then the crash came, the one no one could have predicted, and all the careful structure of her life collapsed. After the funeral, when the sympathy cards began to thin, Eric's tone changed, almost imperceptibly at first. He spoke of practicalities, of the need to protect her from users. When she tried calling an old friend, he frowned and said, "Do you really want them seeing you like this? You know how people talk." At first, she mistook the concern for love. It was easier than admitting how suffocating it felt. But the world around her began to shrink, quietly, methodically. He canceled her lunch with a former coworker, claiming it would look bad so soon after the loss. He suggested she close her social accounts. People don't need to watch you grieve. When her friend Monica dropped by unannounced one afternoon, he met her at the door, polite but immovable, saying Claire was resting. Later, when she asked him about it, he smiled gently. "You need rest more than gossip." Evenings grew quieter. The television played financial news. The books she loved gathered dust. Eric kept track of her days, what she ate, who she called when she slept. His logic was always framed as protection. He only wanted to keep her safe, keep the company stable, keep the world from intruding. He began reviewing her emails just to make sure no one's taking advantage. The first time he raised his voice was over an invoice she'd paid without consulting him. "You can't keep acting like money grows on sympathy," he said, eyes cold, voice low. She froze, startled not by the words, but by how practiced they sounded. Weeks became months. The house, once full of conversation, turned into a museum of muted sounds. The click of a door, the hum of appliances, the rustle of his papers. Claire learned to measure her steps, to speak softly, to choose her moments. Every act of independence became a negotiation. Can I visit the office? Can I call the accountant? Can I drive myself today? His answer was almost always the same. You don't need to worry about that. She started writing in a small notebook, just to remember what days looked like. Pages filled with small domestic details, weather reports, grocery lists, her own thoughts disguised as chores. Laundry detergent, she wrote once, meaning space to breathe. Replace bulbs, meaning I'm disappearing. Still, she loved him or wanted to. Love, she thought, was supposed to withstand grief, to heal. Maybe this was what healing looked like. Quiet, ordered, disciplined. Maybe he was right. She had been fragile, careless, too trusting of people's pity. So she stayed. One evening, standing by the staircase with the lights off, she listened to him speaking on the phone in the study. His tone was smooth, almost tender, but the words were sharp. "She won't question anything," he said. "Not now. She signs whatever I put in front of her." The sentence hung in the air like smoke. He ended the call before she could move. When he came out, he smiled and kissed her forehead. "You should sleep," he said. His eyes looked through her, not at her. Claire nodded, her pulse loud in her ears. That night, she stood in the dark hallway, looking around at the polished floors, the framed photographs, the home her father had built with his hands. For the first time, it felt foreign, like a place she was only visiting. She realized with a dull ache that love could be another kind of lock. And somewhere deep down, she began to understand that the key was already gone. The night it happened was colder than it should have been, a kind of brittle cold that made the air feel sharp in her lungs. Claire had been upstairs, folding laundry in the quiet hum of the house, when she heard the front door slam hard enough to rattle the chandelier. She froze, half expecting an apology to follow. None came. Instead, Eric's footsteps cut through the silence, measured, deliberate, too loud. When she came down, he was standing in the center of the living room, a stack of papers in his hand, his coat still on, drops of melting snow trailing behind him like a breadcrumb trail of frost. The look on his face was unfamiliar, not angry, not even cruel, just done, like someone clocking out of a job. He tossed the papers onto the oak table, the sound louder than it should have been. "Signatures, transfers, finalizations," he said, his tone clipped and businesslike. "But you won't need to worry about any of it now. It's over." Claire blinked, confused. "What are you talking about?" Eric turned toward her slowly, his expression flat. "This house, the accounts, the company, everything you think you own. It's mine now, legally. You gave me power of attorney, remember? You trusted me with it, and I used it. For a moment, she didn't understand the words, as if he were speaking another language. "That's not possible," she whispered. "It was temporary, you said." He laughed once, low and mirthless. "I said whatever I needed to. You didn't read a thing you signed. You just nodded, like a good girl who didn't want to deal with the hard parts." Her knees felt weak. "Eric, please, this isn't you." He stepped closer, close enough for her to see the faint sheen of satisfaction in his eyes. "This has always been me. You just liked the version you made up. The helpless widower's son who needed saving, remember? You fell in love with your own generosity." Her throat closed. The house suddenly felt too big, the air too thin. "Where am I supposed to go?" "That's not my concern." He shrugged off his coat and draped it neatly over the chair, as if ending a long day at the office. "You have 10 minutes. I'd suggest you start packing." "Eric," she said, voice trembling. "Please, I don't have anything. Just let me take some clothes, my mother's necklace, the photo albums." He waved a hand, cutting her off. "You're not hearing me. None of this is yours anymore. You'll leave what doesn't belong to you, and that includes everything in this house." Something in her snapped then, a fragile thread stretched too far. "You used me," she said, barely recognizing her own voice. He smiled, thin and precise. "You make it sound so personal. It's business, Claire. You had assets, I had ambition. The rest was timing." The sound of rain began against the windows, soft at first, then relentless. Claire felt herself sinking, the room spinning around her. "You can't just throw me out. You can't." He leaned against the table, folding his arms. "You'd be surprised what I can do when someone hands me the power to do it. The papers are filed. The lawyers have signed off. You don't even exist in the system anymore. Not in the way that counts." She looked at the wedding photograph on the mantel, the two of them smiling under the magnolia arch, her hand on his chest, eyes full of belief. It looked like strangers. Her voice broke. "Why? You could have had all of this with me." "Because I didn't want it with you," he said simply. "I wanted it without you." The clock in the hall struck 9. The sound seemed to mock her with every chime. 10 minutes, he repeated and turned away. She stood there for a full minute, numb, until the reality of it pressed against her skin like cold iron. Then she moved up the stairs, her breath shallow, her fingers fumbling for the small box where she kept her parents' things. But when she reached the top landing, she heard the click of the front lock. He'd followed her, taking the box from her hands before she could react. "I said nothing," he reminded her, voice like steel. Then he opened the door, grabbed her arm, and pulled her into the hall. The shove wasn't violent, just final. The door slammed behind her, the deadbolt sliding home with a sound that seemed to echo down every corridor of her memory. She stood barefoot on the stone porch, wearing only her thin sleep shirt, the cold biting at her skin. Rain poured in sheets, soaking her hair, running down her face. Through the frosted glass, she saw him turn off the lights one by one, each click erasing another piece of her life. The house, their house, looked like a photograph now, sealed behind glass, untouchable. Claire pressed her palm against the door once, then let it fall. There was no sound but the rain and the faint hum of the city beyond the gates. She turned toward the street, shivering, unsure where to go, the world suddenly enormous and indifferent. Down the block, a car passed, its headlights sweeping over her like a fleeting act of mercy. She thought about running after it, about screaming, but no words came. Her breath fogged the air, white and fleeting, proof that she still existed. Behind her, the house loomed in silence, its windows reflecting nothing but stormlight. When she finally stepped off the porch, the puddles were already forming around her feet. She didn't look back again. The rain swallowed the sound of her footsteps as she walked into the darkness, carrying nothing but the echo of her name, once whispered with love, now erased by the man who had stolen everything. That night, Claire Donovan ceased to exist on paper, and for the first time in her life, she understood what it meant to belong nowhere at all. Rain slicked the streets of downtown Chicago, turning the city into a mirror of lights and movement. Claire wandered through it like a ghost, her hair plastered to her face, her bare feet numb against the concrete. The night swallowed her whole. Traffic hissed, neon signs blinked, the L train screeched overhead. Every doorway she passed seemed to close just before she could step toward it. She moved without thinking, only knowing that she had to keep walking. By midnight, the cold had burrowed deep into her bones. She turned onto East Huron, toward the only name her mind could summon, Monica Hayes. They had once shared everything. Study groups, brunches, whispered confessions after heartbreaks. When Claire's parents died, Monica had been there with flowers and tears and promises to call anytime. Claire held onto that word now like a thread. The building rose above her, sleek and modern, the kind with glass doors and a concierge who never looked up from his tablet. She must have looked unrecognizable, her nightgown hidden beneath a soaked overcoat she'd found on a railing, her hair tangled, her skin gray with exhaustion. She told the concierge her name, asked for Monica, and watched his polite mask falter when he saw her face. "Ma'am," he began carefully, "I'll call up, but it's fine," she whispered. "She'll want to see me." He picked up the phone, murmured something, and waited. A few moments later, Monica appeared at the far end of the lobby in a silk robe, her hair tied back neatly, her expression frozen halfway between shock and embarrassment. "Claire," she said softly. Oh my God, what happened to you?" Claire stepped forward, her voice trembling. "I need help. Just for tonight. Please, Monica, I don't have anywhere else to go." Monica's eyes darted to the concierge, then to the security cameras in the ceiling. She folded her arms tightly, as if to shield herself from the sight. "Claire, this isn't a good idea. People will see you here, and they'll start talking. My neighbors might board. I'm not asking for much," Claire said. "Just a place to dry off. A couch." Monica bit her lip, lowering her voice. "You don't understand. Eric called me. He said you're unwell, that you've been having episodes. I can't. If I let you in, it'll. Please." "Claire, I'm sorry." The words came out rehearsed, polished. "You should find a shelter. They can help you more than I can." And just like that, Monica turned and walked back toward the elevator. The lobby's glass doors sighed open as Claire stumbled out into the rain again. The concierge avoided her eyes. For a moment, she stood under the awning, watching the warm light behind her close off completely. She didn't cry. There was nothing left inside her to spill. By the time she reached South Side, dawn was still hours away. The city had changed shape, high-rises giving way to warehouses and empty lots. She followed a flickering streetlight to a small police precinct, the kind that looked half-forgotten. Inside, the air smelled of burnt coffee and disinfectant. A heavy-set officer sat behind the desk, scrolling through his phone. "Can I help you?" he asked without looking up. "My husband locked me out of my house," she said, voice raw. "He took everything. The accounts, the company, He finally looked at her, eyes moving over her soaked clothes, the dirt on her feet. His tone cooled instantly. "Do you have ID?" He took it, all of it. "My wallet, my passport, everything." "Then I can't file a report. Without identification or proof of residence, there's nothing to verify your claim." "But it's my house," she said, panic flaring. "My parents built it. My name—" "Lady," he interrupted, leaning back. "You got a husband, a lawyer, a story. We got people in here bleeding every night. You want advice. Find a shelter. Get some rest. Come back when you have papers." The click of his keyboard ended the conversation. Outside, the rain had thinned to drizzle. The street was nearly empty, except for a stray dog nosing through trash and the occasional rumble of a passing truck. Claire walked until her legs gave out, collapsing beneath the awning of a closed bus station. Inside, benches were overturned, posters curled with mildew. Wind howled through broken windows, carrying the smell of rust and wet asphalt. She curled up on a bench, arms wrapped around herself, shivering so hard her teeth clattered. The fluorescent light above her flickered, humming faintly, a single, indifferent heartbeat in a world that had already moved on. Through the cracked glass, she could see the city's outline glowing far away, untouchable. For 34 years, she had lived inside its warmth, confident in its order, certain that kindness was inevitable if you had lived decently. Now, as cold air crept under her skin, she understood how wrong she'd been. No one was coming. No one cared. She closed her eyes, listening to the distant wail of sirens, and felt the truth settle heavy in her chest. The world wasn't cruel. Not exactly, it was indifferent. And that, she realized, was far worse. By the end of the month, hunger had become a living thing inside her. Sharp, constant, impossible to ignore. Claire had learned to measure time by the rhythm of her stomach, by how long she could walk before her vision blurred. The city, once an endless promise of light, now felt like a labyrinth of locked doors. She scavenged for half-eaten sandwiches near bus stops, drank water from restroom sinks, and slept wherever the shadows looked softest. The first week had stripped her of pride. The second stripped her of expectation. By the third, she stopped counting days altogether. That night, the wind off Lake Michigan was cruel, biting through the thin coat she'd found in a trash bin days earlier. She was behind a Trader Joe's on North Clark Street, sitting on an overturned crate near the dumpster, waiting for the store lights to dim. Hunger burned through her body like fever. Somewhere inside, a small part of her still resisted, still whispered that she didn't belong here, that she should be inside one of those lit apartments across the street. But the rest of her knew better. The hum of an approaching engine broke the silence. A black Mercedes eased into the narrow alley, its headlights cutting through the steam from a nearby vent. The car was spotless, elegant, the kind of vehicle she used to ride in when visiting contractors with her father. She shrank back into the shadows, instinctively pulling her knees close. The driver's door opened. A man stepped out, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, his tie loosened as if he'd come from a long dinner. He moved with the unthinking confidence of someone who owned everything around him. In his hands were 2 black trash bags, neatly tied. He didn't glance around, didn't hesitate. He set them beside the dumpster, brushed off his hands, and got back into the car. Claire waited. The engine purred for a moment, then faded into the distance, the red taillights swallowed by rain. For a long time, she didn't move. It felt like a test, one more cruel trick from the universe. But the hunger was louder than her pride. She crept toward the bags, her breath visible in the cold air. Her hands trembled as she untied the first knot. The smell that rose wasn't garbage. It was perfume, clean, floral, expensive. She blinked, then pulled out a folded dress, pale beige silk, barely wrinkled. Beneath it, more clothes, a coat, jeans, a soft cashmere sweater, still carrying the faint warmth of a closet. She opened the second bag, bottles of lotion, unopened makeup, perfume still sealed in its box. And at the very bottom, wrapped carefully in tissue, a pair of nude heels that looked almost new. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. Her eyes filled with tears, so quickly she didn't have time to stop them. The sobs came from somewhere deep, raw, uncontrollable. Years of dignity collapsing into gratitude. She clutched the dress to her chest, whispering thank you to no one, to everyone, to the rain, to the universe itself. It wasn't about the clothes. It was about proof that life still saw her, that she wasn't invisible, that somewhere, fate still had a sliver of mercy left. She gathered the items carefully, pressing them into a torn shopping bag she'd found earlier. Her fingers were numb, but her heart beat fast, an old rhythm she thought she'd forgotten. She made her way to a nearby public restroom at the gas station on Diversey, moving quickly, afraid someone might stop her, might take this fragile miracle away. Inside, the fluorescent light flickered overhead, humming like an insect. The mirror was cracked, the sink stained with rust. Still, it felt like sanctuary. Claire turned on the faucet, the water icy but clean. She stripped off her filthy clothes and scrubbed her arms, her face, her hair, washing away weeks of dirt and despair. She used paper towels to dry herself, the roughness almost comforting. When she slipped into the silk dress, it clung gently to her skin. The fabric was soft, warm, human. She sprayed the perfume once into the air and stepped through the mist, closing her eyes. The scent, jasmine, and something faintly citrus, wrapped around her like a memory of who she'd been. She stared at her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back was thinner, paler, but alive. Her eyes were still her own, still holding the spark that had survived everything else. She didn't look like a beggar. She looked like someone starting over. Claire smiled for the first time in weeks, a small, broken thing that still managed to reach her eyes. She whispered, "Thank you," not knowing to whom. Outside, the rain had stopped. Puddles mirrored the glow of streetlights. She stepped out into the cold air, the heels in her hand, her bare feet against the wet pavement. The world looked different now. Still harsh, still vast, but no longer hopeless. Somewhere inside her chest, beneath the hunger and exhaustion, something flickered, small, stubborn, steady. It wasn't much, just a pulse of warmth, a hint of light. But for the first time since that door had closed behind her, Claire believed it might be enough to find her way back. Morning crept over the city in a pale wash of gray and gold. Claire woke beneath a concrete overpass, her makeshift shelter damp with mist. The silk dress she'd worn through the night was wrinkled but intact, and the perfume still clung faintly to her skin. For the first time in weeks, she didn't feel invisible. She felt possible. She looked at the handful of things she'd collected, a scarf, a pair of heels, a bracelet tucked safely in her pocket. The bracelet wasn't hers. She'd found it at the bottom of one of the bags, small and delicate, with a single diamond stone. She held it up to the morning light, wondering who had owned it, what kind of woman had decided to let it go. And then, quietly, she made a choice. By noon, she'd walked to a pawn shop on the corner of North Avenue. The man behind the counter was older, his eyes quick, but not unkind. He examined the bracelet, appraised it, and named a figure that made her breath catch. It wasn't much, barely enough to live on, but it was something. She hesitated only a second before nodding. He slid the bills across the counter, and for the first time in months, she felt the weight of money in her hands. That afternoon, she went to a small government office on Division Street to start the process of replacing her identification. The clerk didn't ask questions, just handed her forms, took her picture, and told her to wait 3 weeks for the new card. 3 weeks. For most people, that was nothing. For Claire, it was an eternity. Still, she smiled, thanked him, and walked out with a paper receipt that had her name on it. Her real name. She folded it carefully and placed it inside her coat pocket like it was made of glass. With what remained of her money, she found a small room for rent in an aging brick building near Humboldt Park. The hallway smelled faintly of fried onions and bleach, and the wallpaper peeled in long, curling strips. The room itself was barely larger than the bed inside it, but the window faced the park. She could see the trees sway in the wind, their bare branches scratching at the winter sky. It wasn't much, but it was hers. For the first few nights, she lay awake listening to the pipes groan and the distant wail of sirens. Fear visited her in flashes of Eric, of the past, of the world that had turned its back on her. But exhaustion always won. Each morning, she rose with a little more strength than the last. She spent her days walking, scanning bulletin boards and classified ads, asking at diners, warehouses, and office buildings. Most places didn't even let her finish her sentence before shaking their heads. "We're not hiring. Try back in the spring. You don't have any recent experience." At night, she'd return to her room, feet aching, clutching the hope that tomorrow might be different. One morning, as she passed through the industrial district near Ashland Avenue, a paper taped to a construction site fence caught her eye. Administrative assistant, wanted, Lawson Construction Group. The name made her pause. Construction. It felt like a ghost from her past had whispered it. For a long moment, she stood there, staring at the sign, the wind tugging at her coat. Then she took down the number and walked to the nearest cafe, where she used their payphone to call. The woman who answered was polite but rushed. "You have your resume?" "I can bring it in," Claire said quickly, her voice steady. "Tomorrow morning at 9, the woman replied. "Bring ID if you have it." Claire didn't have proper ID yet, but she had the receipt from the office, the paper with her name and the government seal. It would have to do. That night, she washed her clothes in the sink, pressed the wrinkles out with her hands, and brushed her hair until it shone faintly in the dim bathroom light. She borrowed a folder from the landlady's son to hold her resume, a simple one she'd typed at the public library earlier that week. She practiced her answers in the mirror. "Yes, I used to manage accounts. Yes, I'm comfortable with spreadsheets and client calls. Yes, I can start immediately." The next morning, she arrived at the Lawson Construction Group office 15 minutes early. The building was small but well kept, with steel beams lining the entryway and a faint smell of coffee and fresh paint. A young receptionist smiled as she approached. "Good morning. You're here for the assistant position." "Yes," Claire said. "Claire Donovan. Mr. Lawson will see you shortly." Claire sat in the waiting area, her hands clasped in her lap. The tick of the wall clock was the only sound in the room. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, to silence the voice in her head that whispered she didn't belong here. A door opened. The receptionist looked up. "Mr. Lawson, this is Claire Donovan." Claire rose, turned, and froze. Standing in the doorway was the man from the alley, the one who had stepped out of the Mercedes and left behind 2 bags that had saved her life. His hair was slightly disheveled now, his tie loosened, but his presence filled the room effortlessly. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, and something passed between them, recognition, disbelief, maybe fate. He blinked, his expression unreadable. Then, with quiet curiosity, he said, "Ms. Donovan, please come in." Claire swallowed hard, her heart thudding in her chest. As she stepped into his office, she realized she was crossing a line between 2 lives, the one she had lost and the one she might still have a chance to rebuild. David Lawson had built his company from the ground up. 3 decades of contracts, late nights, and quiet battles fought behind polished conference tables. He had learned to read people quickly, the way a builder reads the grain of wood or the weight of steel. Most came into his office with practiced confidence or desperation disguised as ambition. But when Claire Donovan sat across from him that morning, she carried neither. She was calm, composed, but there was something in her eyes, something heavy, like someone who had seen the world collapse and refused to let it bury her. He glanced over her resume again. It was sparse, too sparse for someone her age. Education, yes. Experience, vaguely defined. No references. It should have been a quick dismissal. Yet her answers during the interview weren't rehearsed. They were real. When he asked how she handled pressure, she didn't offer the usual platitudes. "You stop expecting fairness," she'd said simply, "and you do the next thing that needs to be done." He leaned back in his chair, studying her. "This position isn't glamorous," he warned. "A lot of paperwork, long hours, occasional legal research. You'd be assisting my counsel directly." "That's fine," she replied. "I don't need glamorous." Her tone was steady, professional, but her hands, folded neatly in her lap, betrayed a faint tremor. It wasn't fear, he realized. It was restraint. He nodded once. "You can start Monday. We'll put you on a temporary contract for now." When she left his office, he found himself watching her through the glass. Shoulders straight, pace measured, the quiet composure of someone rebuilding from ashes. The first weeks were uneventful. Claire arrived early every morning, always dressed with simple elegance, modest blouses, pressed slacks, hair tied neatly back. She spoke little but worked with precision, often staying long after others had left. Her handwriting was impeccable, her emails concise, her research thorough. At first, the staff kept their distance. She was polite but distant, never joined for coffee, rarely smiled at jokes. In the break room, she'd sit by the window with a paperback, eating an apple and drinking tea from a chipped mug she'd brought from home. Rumors circulated quietly. Some said she was divorced, others that she'd come from out of state. No one knew, and she didn't offer. David noticed, not in the way a man notices beauty, but the way a craftsman notices integrity. There was something old-fashioned about her work ethic and unspoken pride. Once, during a case involving a zoning dispute that had dragged for months, Claire spotted a clause buried in a contractor's report, one that nullified the opposing party's claim entirely. It was a detail most would have missed, and it saved the company hundreds of thousands of dollars. When David called her into his office to commend her, she only said, "I just read what others didn't," and left quietly. He watched her more closely after that, not out of suspicion, but curiosity. There was a sadness about her that didn't fit the sharpness of her mind. Sometimes, when she thought no one was looking, her gaze would drift toward the window, as if searching for something far beyond the skyline. One evening, long after most of the office had emptied, he passed by her desk and found her still working. "You should go home," he said lightly. She looked up, startled. "I will. Just finishing the report." He smiled. "You've said that 3 times this week." Her lips curved faintly. "I suppose I don't have much waiting for me at home." Something in the simplicity of that answer stayed with him. Months passed, and the company flourished. Claire became indispensable. Her insight during negotiations, her calm in crises, her ability to see through chaos. When a multi-million-dollar arbitration threatened to bankrupt a partner firm, she pieced together documents and correspondences like a puzzle, uncovering discrepancies that turned the case entirely in Lawson's favor. After the verdict, David called the team for a brief celebration. Champagne glasses clinked, laughter filled the room, and someone raised a toast to the quiet genius in legal. Claire smiled politely, accepted the gesture, and excused herself soon after. Later, when David found her in the hallway packing up her papers, he said, "You know, they're right. You saved us today." She shrugged, tucking a folder under her arm. "It was a team effort. You don't have to be modest." "I'm not," she replied. "I just don't like noise." He chuckled softly. "You really are different from the rest." Her eyes flickered up to his, gray, steady, unreadable. "Different isn't always good, Mr. Lawson. Sometimes it's exactly what's needed," he said. For a moment, something unspoken passed between them. A recognition, perhaps, of 2 people who had both lived too long with responsibility and silence. Then she gave a polite nod and left, the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the air long after she was gone. In the months that followed, David found himself relying on her judgment more and more. He'd catch glimpses of her in the morning light by the office window, reading over contracts with quiet focus, and wonder what story had carved that calm into her. To others, she was efficient, reliable, unremarkable. But to him, she was something else entirely. Someone who carried dignity like armor, who had known loss yet refused to wear it as a wound. And though he couldn't explain why, every time he saw her smile, brief and restrained, he felt the same strange certainty he'd felt the night he left those 2 bags behind the grocery store, that some acts of kindness, however small, had ways of circling back when the world was ready to heal. The office was nearly empty when the storm began, a steady, rhythmic drumming against the glass that blurred the skyline into streaks of silver and shadow. The rest of the staff had gone home hours ago, leaving only the hum of the printer and the faint buzz of the vending machine. David leaned back in his chair, loosening his tie, and glanced at the clock. It was well past 9. Claire was still at her desk, surrounded by neatly stacked files and a half-finished cup of tea gone cold. She was reading over a contract, her eyes moving with quiet intensity, a lock of hair falling across her forehead. "You know," David said from his doorway. Most sane people left 2 hours ago. Without looking up, she smiled. I've never been accused of being sane. He chuckled, then hesitated. How about dinner? There's a pizza place still open on the corner. We could eat here, if you don't mind paper plates and terrible lighting. She blinked, surprised, then nodded. That actually sounds perfect. 10 minutes later, the smell of pepperoni and roasted garlic filled the conference room. They sat by the wide window overlooking the city, slices of pizza on napkins, the lights of Chicago glittering like distant stars. Rain traced long trails down the glass, and for a moment, the world outside felt far away, softened, almost kind. David leaned back in his chair, watching the reflection of the city ripple across the window. You know, he said, his voice quiet, I used to have an office just like this one. Bigger, actually. Downtown. Top floor, Riverview. I thought I had everything figured out. What happened? Claire asked softly. He smiled without humor. I got married to the wrong person. Beautiful, brilliant, ambitious. We built everything together, or at least I thought we did. Then one day, I came home early and found out I'd been building it alone. Claire didn't speak. The rain filled the silence between them. She left, he continued. Took what she could, burned the rest. I spent months thinking about what I'd done wrong. Eventually, I realized it wasn't about fault. It was about truth. Some people only know how to love until it stops being convenient. Claire stared at her reflection in the window, her own eyes shimmering in the glass. And you started over, she said. I didn't have a choice. His gaze shifted toward her. I'd built Lawson Construction from what was left. I thought if I could just keep moving forward, maybe I'd stop looking back. She nodded slowly, understanding more than she wanted to. That's the thing about losing everything, she said quietly. You learn what's real only after it's gone. He studied her face, the way her voice carried the weight of memory. You talk like someone who knows, he said. Claire hesitated, her fingers tightening around the paper cup of tea. The truth had lived inside her for so long, locked behind polite smiles and professionalism, that saying it aloud felt dangerous. But in the soft hum of the rain, with the warmth of pizza between them and no judgment in his eyes, the walls began to crack. I used to have a life like that, she began, her voice trembling slightly. A home, a company, a husband I thought loved me. When my parents died, I lost my balance. He told me he'd take care of everything, and I believed him. She drew a shaky breath. One night he threw me out, just like that. No warning, no mercy. I had nothing. No ID, no money. I slept in bus stations, alleyways, even a construction site once. I didn't think I'd make it out. David's hand stilled on the table. Claire, it was winter, she continued, her tone steady now. I remember the cold more than anything. It got inside you, into your bones. But one night I found something, 2 bags near a dumpster. Clothes, perfume, even shoes. It felt like someone up there hadn't forgotten me. He froze, realization flickering in his eyes, but she didn't notice. I thought it was the universe's way of saying I still mattered, she whispered, that I wasn't finished yet. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then David reached across the table and took her hand gently. His touch was warm, grounding. You're not a victim, Claire, he said, his voice low and sure. You're a survivor, and survivors don't owe the world an explanation. Her breath caught. The words sank deep, settling in the places still raw and aching. No one had ever said that to her. Not with belief, not without pity. She blinked, trying to speak, but the tears came first, silent, uninvited, unstoppable. David didn't let go. He just held her hand, letting her cry in peace. The rain outside softened, as if the city itself were exhaling. When she finally looked up, her voice was barely a whisper. I haven't told anyone that before. I know, he said quietly, and I'm honored that you did. The air between them changed then. Something unspoken but alive. Claire felt it like a pulse beneath her skin, a warmth that wasn't fear this time, but something gentler, unfamiliar. Hope, maybe. Or trust. They sat in silence, watching the city lights flicker against the dark. Somewhere far below, a car horn echoed, and the rain eased into mist. When David finally stood, he looked at her with a softness that was almost reverence. "Get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow's another beginning." Claire nodded, wiping her cheeks, a faint smile tugging at her lips. For the first time in years, she believed him. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, the kind that passes quietly unnoticed, until something shifts the air around it forever. David had called Claire into his office to discuss a client proposal. Papers were spread across his desk, sunlight pouring in through the blinds in warm golden stripes. They had been working side by side for months now, an easy rhythm forming between them. Words were no longer guarded. Silences were no longer awkward. When the conversation drifted from contracts to life, neither of them tried to stop it. David leaned back in his chair, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You know," he said, "funny how life cleans itself up sometimes. When I finally signed the divorce papers, I packed everything of hers into 2 black bags, clothes, perfume, all that expensive nonsense, and left them by the dumpster behind the Trader Joe's near North Clark. Didn't even look back." He said it casually, as if recounting a small, unimportant victory. But the words hit Claire like a blow. Her breath caught. Her fingers went cold around the pen she was holding. The air in the room seemed to collapse. David didn't notice at first. He kept talking, voice distant. It was closure, I guess. The end of a chapter one never thought I'd finish. Claire's lips parted, but no sound came out. Trader Joe's, North Clark, 2 black bags. Her heartbeat roared in her ears, drowning out everything else. She could still see it, the alley, the rain, the headlights fading into the dark. The silk dress, the perfume, the shoes. The night her life had turned from despair to survival. Her hand trembled, the pen rolling off the desk and clattering onto the floor. That small sound finally drew his attention. "Claire," he asked, frowning, "are you all right?" She opened her mouth, but her throat felt tight. Those bags," she whispered. "When was that?" He blinked, surprised by the question. "Last winter. Early December, I think." "Why?" Her eyes shimmered, and when she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "Because I found them." David stared at her, confused. "What do you mean, you found them?" She took a slow breath, forcing herself to look at him. "That night, I was living on the streets. I hadn't eaten in days. I saw your car stop near the dumpster. You left 2 bags. I thought it was trash." Her voice cracked, but it wasn't. Inside were clothes, perfume, shoes. It was everything I needed to stay alive. The color drained from his face. For a moment, neither of them moved. The hum of the air conditioner filled the silence like static. He rose slowly from his chair, his eyes searching hers. "You're telling me those bags, they saved me, David," she said, tears beginning to well. "I don't know why I even opened them. I just needed something to hold on to. I put on that dress and looked in the mirror, and for the first time, I saw someone who could keep going." He pressed a hand to his mouth, his breath uneven. "I can't believe this." Claire shook her head, smiling through her tears. "Neither can I. But maybe it wasn't an accident. Maybe it was supposed to happen that way." He stepped closer, still stunned, his eyes full of something raw and wordless. "All this time," he murmured, "you were the reason I slept better that night. I told myself I'd finally done something right by letting go. I never imagined it could mean something like this." Claire wiped at her cheeks, laughing softly through the tears. "You did. You just didn't know it." The room was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet, heavy, sacred, full of understanding. The sunlight fell across them both, soft and golden, as if the world itself had paused to listen. David crossed the space between them slowly, almost afraid the moment might break if he moved too fast. "You once told me," he said quietly, "that you thought the universe hadn't forgotten you. Maybe this was how it remembered." Claire looked up at him, eyes glistening. "Maybe it remembered us both." He reached out, hesitated for a heartbeat, then gently took her hands in his. She didn't pull away. The warmth of his touch felt like something she'd been searching for her entire life. Not passion, not rescue, but recognition. Two people who had lost everything, finding in each other the proof that nothing is ever truly gone. "Claire," he said softly, his voice breaking just slightly, "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to," she whispered. He drew her closer and she let him, his arms wrapped around her, steady and safe. And for the first time since her world had fallen apart, she stopped trembling. The city stretched beyond the window, lights flickering in the late afternoon haze. Somewhere in the distance, a train passed, its low rumble fading into quiet. Inside that small office, time seemed to hold its breath. David closed his eyes, resting his chin against her hair. "Maybe that's what healing looks like," he murmured. "Two broken things that somehow fit." Claire's tears fell silently, her hands clutching the back of his shirt as if anchoring herself to the present. For the first time in years, the ache in her chest began to ease, not because she had forgotten the pain, but because someone else was finally helping her carry it. They stayed like that, neither speaking, until the light outside dimmed into dusk. And when they finally pulled apart, there was no need for words. The look between them said it all. Fate hadn't taken from them, it had led them here. The courtroom at the Cook County Courthouse was a world of echoes and light. Polished wood, murmured whispers, the scent of old paper, and tension thick enough to feel. Claire sat at the plaintiff's table beside David and his legal team, her hands folded neatly, her expression calm. It had taken nearly a year of filings, investigations, and unearthing every hidden document Eric thought he'd buried. And now, finally, it had come to this. Across the room, Eric sat with his attorney, the same smug composure he used to wear at dinner parties now cracked around the edges. His expensive suit hung looser, his eyes darting between the judge and the crowd as though still trying to control a narrative that had already escaped him. The proceedings had lasted for days, testimonies, bank records, and the moment the forensic accountant presented proof that Eric had funneled Claire's inheritance into offshore accounts under his own name. Each revelation stripped another layer of his confidence away, until he was no longer the charming manipulator, but just a frightened man cornered by truth. David's legal team had worked tirelessly. He'd offered his firm's full support the moment she decided to press charges, refusing to let her face it alone. "This isn't about revenge," he told her. "It's about restoring your name." And he'd meant it. When Eric took the stand, his arrogance returned for a moment. He spoke with feigned sincerity, insisting Claire had been unstable after her parents' deaths, that she'd voluntarily signed everything to him for her own peace of mind. He even tried to smile at her, the same rehearsed smile that had once made her believe him. But this time she didn't look away. When her turn came, Claire stood, adjusted her jacket, and walked to the stand with quiet confidence. Her voice didn't shake as she recounted the night he'd thrown her out, the rain, the locked door, the loss. She didn't embellish or cry. She simply told the truth. And for the first time, everyone in that room saw Eric for what he was. The judge listened carefully, her expression unreadable until the end. When the verdict was read, the words hung in the air like a cleansing storm. The court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Miss Claire Donovan. The defendant, Eric Whitmore, is found guilty of fraud, coercion, and unlawful appropriation of assets. All properties and accounts are to be returned to their rightful owner, along with punitive damages. Eric's face drained of color. His lawyer put a hand on his shoulder, but he sat frozen, staring at nothing. Claire didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply closed her eyes for a moment, breathing deeply. It wasn't joy she felt, it was release. The years of silence, humiliation, and fear had all led to this moment of stillness. Justice didn't roar. It whispered. David reached over, resting a steady hand on hers. "It's over," he said softly. She nodded, tears glimmering but unshed. "No," she whispered. "It's just beginning." Spring came early to Evanston that year. The garden behind David's home bloomed in soft colors. Pale tulips, lavender, and wild roses Claire had planted herself. The afternoon sun filtered through the trees, scattering light over white chairs arranged in quiet symmetry. There were no photographers, no press, no extravagance. Just a handful of friends, a violinist, and two people who had found peace in the unlikeliest of places. Claire stood under a wooden arch, draped with fabric and wildflowers. Her dress was simple, ivory silk that caught the sunlight like water. The same diamond bracelet she'd once pawned for survival now rested again on her wrist, returned to her months ago by David with a smile and the words, "You've earned everything back." David waited at the end of the aisle, his expression soft, his gray suit pressed but unpretentious. When their eyes met, she felt the world quiet around them. There was no grand declaration, no orchestra swell, just the sound of wind through leaves and the steady rhythm of two hearts that had finally found their way home. As the officiant began to speak, Claire's thoughts drifted, not backward, but through the path that had led her here. The nights she'd slept beneath the city's cold bridges, the alley behind Trader Joe's, the mirror in the gas station bathroom where she'd seen her reflection and whispered, "Keep going." Every moment of despair had built the foundation for this one. When David took her hands, his voice was low but unwavering. "You taught me that love doesn't start with perfection. It starts with truth," he said. "And I promise you, for the rest of our lives, the truth is all you'll ever get from me." Her voice trembled when she answered, "And you showed me that kindness isn't weakness. It's the strongest thing there is." They exchanged rings as the sunlight spilled across the garden. The world seemed to hold its breath as the officiant smiled. "You may kiss the bride." When his lips met hers, it wasn't the spark of a new beginning. It was the gentle closing of a wound that had finally healed. Applause rippled softly through the guests, but Claire barely heard it. All she could feel was the warmth of his hands and the quiet certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Later, as the guests mingled and laughter drifted through the air, Claire stepped away for a moment, standing at the edge of the garden. The golden light of late afternoon touched her face. She closed her eyes, letting it soak through her skin, through the spaces that had once been hollow. For the first time, she didn't feel like she was reclaiming her old life. She was living a new one, built not from what she'd lost, but from what she'd become. Behind her, David's voice called gently, "Mrs. Lawson?" She turned, smiling, the name fitting her like a promise. "Yes." He reached out his hand. "Come back inside. The sun's setting." Claire glanced toward the horizon, the fading light, the soft hum of the world around her, and then back at the man who had once unknowingly saved her life. She took his hand and whispered, "I already have." And as they walked together beneath the drifting petals, the last light of day wrapped around them like a blessing. After all the storms and silences after betrayal and survival, Claire had found what she'd thought was lost forever: peace, justice, and love that asked for nothing but honesty in return.